From childhood, music was her greatest passion, but life forced her to bury it in the name of stability. Married to a millionaire lawyer, she became a prisoner of a cold and controlling marriage, where her voice had no space. But at a party, one night after playing the piano for the first time in years, she heard from her husband the phrase that would change everything: "You look so poor like that." It was at that moment she decided to rewrite her story, transforming pain into strength, and music into her greatest liberation. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. Sarah adjusted her black party dress and took a deep breath before descending the marble staircase of the mansion. Her fingers, which once danced with such freedom over the piano keys, now trembled slightly as she held onto the golden handrail. Downstairs, dozens of important guests awaited the perfect hostess that James, her husband, was so proud to show off. "Darling, finally, the Johnsons just arrived." James greeted her at the foot of the stairs with his usual calculated smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. His impeccable Italian suit and imported cologne completed the image of the successful lawyer he so prized. The mansion was filled with businessmen, politicians, and their respective wives, all wearing their best clothes and most rehearsed smiles. Sarah knew this environment well. It was another of her husband's social events to strengthen his professional connections. She knew her role: smile, agree, serve as a frame for the perfect picture James painted of his life. The Steinway and Sons. Grand piano, a wedding gift from her father-in-law, occupied a prominent place in the main room. It was a magnificent piece, but for 3 years it had served only as decoration. Sarah avoided looking at it, as if doing so could ignore the emptiness growing in her chest. "Sarah, it's been so long." Emily Johnson hugged her effusively. "I still remember you playing at that charity recital before the wedding. Why don't you play anymore?" Before she could answer, James intervened with his velvety voice. "Sarah has been dedicating herself to more important causes now. Isn't that right, dear? Volunteer work with the wives of the firm's partners takes up a lot of time." Sarah forced a smile, swallowing the words she never said. She remembered her mother, Elizabeth, the soprano who enchanted audiences wherever she went. How would she react to seeing her daughter like this, so distant from the music that was once her life? Between conversations, Sarah noticed the arrival of 2 new guests who stood out from the environment. The older one, Anthony Walker, was known in cultural circles as one of the greatest supporters of the arts in the country. His son, Michael, younger and more informal than the other guests, carried an air of genuine disinterest in the social games happening there. "Mrs. Parker," Anthony approached with a natural elegance, different from the affectation of the other guests. "Your father, Charlie, was one of the best piano tuners I've ever known. He had a special gift for awakening the soul of instruments." The comment hit Sarah like a wave of memories. She remembered the afternoons spent in her father's workshop, watching his skilled hands working on the innards of pianos, restoring their ability to produce perfect sounds. Music had always been her family's language, until silence was imposed on her life. "The piano looks a bit abandoned," observed Michael, approaching with a glass of wine. His brown eyes conveyed sincere curiosity. "It would be a shame for a Steinway like that not to be played." "My wife no longer has time for such frivolities," James commented, possessively placing his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We have more relevant commitments, don't we?" Sarah felt the weight of that hand like never before. Each of James's words was like a dissonant note in a melody she no longer recognized as her own. She looked at the piano, and for the first time in a long time felt her fingers tingle with the desire to play. The young Michael noticed her restlessness, and with a gentle smile said, "Music is never frivolous, Mr. Parker. It's the purest expression of the human soul." At that moment, something awakened in Sarah. A small flame that had long been dormant began to burn again. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Music isn't something we do, darling. It's something we are." The night followed its predictable course, but inside Sarah, a silent revolution was beginning to take shape. The piano, once merely a decorative object, began to emit a call she could no longer ignore. It was as if every note not played in the last few years was about to find its liberation. The conversation with Michael and Anthony awakened in Sarah memories she had tried so hard to bury. As she circulated among the guests, she felt Michael's attentive gaze following her, movements, as if he could see beyond the social mask she wore with such precision. "Sarah, you must meet the new intern at the firm." James pulled her by the arm, leading her to a young woman in a red dress. "This is Amanda Prado, a promising corporate law prospect." Amanda smiled with a barely disguised air of superiority. Sarah couldn't help but notice the way the intern looked at James, an intimacy that went beyond the professional relationship. Her husband, in turn, kept his hand on the young woman's back for too long. "I heard you used to study music," Amanda commented, with a tone bordering on mockery. "It must have been interesting, but you did well to choose a more solid path." Sarah felt her blood boil, but years of conditioning made her keep the placid smile on her face. "Music shapes the soul in ways you could never understand, Miss Prado." James gave her a warning look, but was interrupted by Anthony Walker, who approached with his son. "Mrs. Parker, forgive my boldness, but it would be an honor to hear you play something," said Anthony, gesturing towards the piano. "Michael told me about the compliments your father always gave to your talent." The room fell into an expectant silence. Sarah felt all eyes on her, especially James's, which had a dangerous gleam. "Don't be modest, Sarah," Michael provoked with an encouraging smile. "Music shouldn't remain imprisoned." Before James could intervene, Sarah walked to the piano. Her heels echoed on the marble floor like a metronome, marking the beat of her own courage. As she sat on the bench, her hands trembled, but as soon as she touched the keys, an old and familiar force took over her being. The first notes of Claire de Lune filled the room. It was her mother's favorite song, the one they used to play together on Sunday afternoons. Each chord brought back a piece of her essence that had been systematically silenced over the years. The guests watched, hypnotized. Anthony closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by the melody. Michael observed with a mixture of admiration and sadness, as if understanding the depth of that moment. Amanda, in turn, seemed uncomfortable, while James maintained a forced smile that didn't hide his contained fury. When the last note dissipated in the air, there was a moment of reverent silence before the applause began. Sarah felt tears in her eyes, but they weren't of sadness. It was as if something inside her had finally been liberated. "You look so poor playing piano like that." James's cutting voice sounded close to her ear, low enough for only her to hear, but laden with contempt. The comment, which at another time would have devastated her, now provoked a different reaction. Sarah looked at her husband and, for the first time, saw clearly the man behind the facade of perfection. She saw the pettiness, the control, the need to diminish her to feel superior. "True poverty, James, is living a life without passion," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Anthony quickly approached, breaking the tension of the moment. "Magnificent, Mrs. Parker. We need to talk about some cultural projects I'm developing. Your talent can't be restricted to social events." Michael also approached, subtly positioning himself between Sarah and James. "My father is right. How long has it been since you performed professionally?" "Sarah has other priorities now," James cut in, his voice masking irritation with artificial cordiality. "Isn't that right, dear?" But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was on her father's words. "Music is like water, sweetheart. You can dam it up for a while, but it always finds a way to flow." At that moment, sitting at the piano, she felt the dam beginning to crack. Anthony took a card from his pocket and handed it to Sarah. "My office is in the cultural center. I'd love to talk to you about music in a more appropriate environment." James tried to intercept the card, but Sarah was quicker, tucking it into the small pocket of her dress. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. For the first time in years, she had made a choice for herself. The morning after the party, Sarah woke up before sunrise. James hadn't slept at home, claiming an emergency meeting at the office. She knew it was a lie, but for the first time, she didn't feel pain because of it. She sat on the balcony of her room, watching the mansion's garden gain colors with the first rays of light, and took Anthony's card from her robe pocket. Little Ethan, her 7-year-old son, appeared sleepily at the balcony door. "Mom, are you going to play piano again today? It was so beautiful yesterday." Sarah smiled, feeling her heart tighten. Ethan had inherited her musical sensitivity, but James always discouraged any interest the boy had in art, insisting on activities he considered more suitable for a future lawyer. "Come here, my love," she called, hugging her son. "Do you want me to teach you a song?" The boy's eyes lit up. "But Daddy said piano is for..." "Piano is for those who love music," Sarah interrupted, with a firmness that surprised them both. "And we love music, don't we?" They went down together to the main room. The piano, still open from the night before, looked different now. No longer a symbol of her prison, but a door to freedom. Sarah sat on the bench with Ethan at her side and began to teach him the basic notes of Ode to Joy. It was at this moment that Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, who had worked in the house for years, hurriedly entered the room. "Mrs. Sarah, Mr. James is arriving, and he doesn't seem to be in a good mood." Sarah felt her stomach churn but didn't move from the piano. "Ethan, darling, go have your breakfast with Mrs. Thompson." As soon as she was alone, she heard James's heavy footsteps echoing on the marble. He entered the room like a storm, still wearing last night's clothes, with the sweet perfume of another environment impregnated in his clothes. "What do you think you're doing?" he vociferated. "First that ridiculous show yesterday, now you're putting ideas in the boy's head?" Sarah remained seated at the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys. "It wasn't a show, James. It was music. Something you never managed to understand. I perfectly understand that my wife is behaving like a rebellious teenager." He approached, leaning over her. "Do you have any idea how much you embarrassed me yesterday? Anthony Walker is an old fool, but he has important connections, and you were there, showing off like an artist?" Sarah completed, standing up to face him. "Like someone who has their own talent, who doesn't need to live in her husband's shadow?" James laughed scornfully. "Talent? Do you really think you can resume a career after so long? Be realistic, Sarah. You're my wife, the mother of my child. That should be enough." "How is it enough for you, James?" she asked, surprising him. "How was your emergency meeting with Amanda?" The slap didn't happen. James stopped with his hand in the air, surprised by his own reaction and by the fact that Sarah hadn't backed away. She was facing him with a strength he hadn't seen in years. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice trembling not from fear but from contained anger. "Never again." Sarah's phone vibrated on top of the piano, a message from Michael Walker. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker. My father was enchanted by your performance yesterday. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss some possibilities. What do you think?" James grabbed the phone before she could reach it and read the message, his face contorting with fury. "So that's it? You barely start playing and you're already chatting with the Walker playboy?" "Give me back the phone, James," Sarah demanded, extending her hand. "Or what? You'll run away with him? Do you really think anyone will take a failed middle-aged pianist seriously?" At that moment, Ethan returned to the room, his small eyes wide with fear at the scene. Sarah felt something awaken inside her. It wasn't just for herself that she needed to fight. "Ethan, go back to the kitchen," she asked, without taking her eyes off James. "Mrs. Thompson, please take him to school today. His father and I need to talk." When they were alone again, Sarah headed for the stairs. "I'm going to change. I have an important meeting today." "If you walk out that door," James threatened, "you'll..." "Do what?" She turned, facing him. "You'll stop me from working, from playing piano, from having friends? Oh, wait. You've already done all that. And you know what? It didn't work." Climbing the stairs, Sarah felt each step like a note of a new song she was beginning to compose, the song of her liberation. Anthony's card weighed in her pocket like a promise of change, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the future. The Walker Cultural Center was an oasis amidst the skyscrapers of downtown. The restored historic building, with its huge windows and Art Deco architecture, seemed to hold within its walls all the dreams Sarah had abandoned. As she climbed the marble steps of the entrance, she felt her heart race, not from fear, but from expectation. At the reception, a friendly young woman led her to the top floor. Anthony Walker's office was exactly as she had imagined. Walls covered with posters of historic concerts, a grand piano by the window, and most importantly, an atmosphere of genuine respect for art. "Sarah," Anthony welcomed her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came. Michael should arrive any moment. Would you like some coffee?" While they waited, Anthony showed her old photos of performances. In one of them, Sarah recognized her mother, Elizabeth, singing at a charity recital. "I was at this concert," said Anthony, his eyes shining with recollection. "Your mother had a voice that touched people's souls. And you, my dear, inherited that same gift, only through the piano." Michael arrived carrying a folder full of documents. He wore a blazer over a t-shirt, a look that blended the businessman with the art lover he was. "Sorry I'm late. The traffic was impossible," he explained, sitting next to his father. "But I brought something I think will interest you, Sarah." He opened the folder and began to explain about a cultural revitalization project they were developing. The idea was to create a music school in an underprivileged neighborhood, offering free classes to children and young people. "We need someone who understands not just music, but who knows how to transmit that passion. Someone like you." Sarah felt her hands tremble. I don't know if I'm prepared. It's been so long since I played professionally." "Talent doesn't disappear," Anthony gently interrupted. "It just sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken." At that moment, Sarah's cell phone rang. It was a message from James. "Where are you? We have a lunch with the firm's partners. Don't embarrass me again." Michael noticed her unease. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," she replied, putting the phone away without answering the message. "Please continue. I want to know more about the project." For the next hour, they discussed details of the work. Sarah would be responsible for coordinating the piano classes, with complete freedom to develop her own methodology. The salary offered was surprisingly good, and she would have access to an apartment in the cultural center itself, traditionally used by resident artists. "I know it's an important decision," said Michael, noticing her hesitation, "but sometimes we need to take a leap of faith." "James won't accept it," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to them. Anthony leaned towards her, his face serious. "Sarah, allow me to be frank. I knew your mother, I knew your father. They were extraordinary artists, but above all, they were free people. What I saw at that party was an extraordinary woman trapped in a golden cage. The question is, are you ready to open that cage?" The words hit Sarah like a bolt of clarity. She remembered Ethan, how his eyes had sparkled when he played piano for the first time. She thought of all the times James had belittled her, how Amanda looked at him, how her life had become a succession of empty social events. "When can I start?" she asked, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Michael smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes. "How about tomorrow? We can show you the school space, introduce you to the team." "Perfect," Sarah replied, feeling a wave of adrenaline. "I just need to sort out a few things at home first." As she said goodbye, Anthony hugged her paternally. "Your mother would be proud," he whispered. In the elevator, Michael accompanied her. "Sarah," he called before the doors opened on the ground floor, "I know it's none of my business, but if you need help with anything, you can count on me." She nodded, grateful, feeling the weight of the card with her new work contract in her purse. As she left the building, the afternoon sun momentarily blinded her. Or perhaps it was the tears of emotion she finally allowed herself to shed. Tears of fear, joy, liberation. Her phone rang again. This time it was a photo of Ethan, sent by Mrs. Thompson, showing the boy trying to play piano alone. Under the photo, a message. "He says he wants to be just like Mommy." At that moment, Sarah knew there was no turning back. The next act of her life was about to begin, and for the first time in years, she would be the composer of her own story. Sarah entered the house feeling the weight of the contract in her bag, as if she were carrying a time bomb. The mansion was silent, except for the muffled sound of voices coming from James's office. She immediately recognized Amanda's voice among stifled laughter. She climbed the stairs quietly, heading to Ethan's room. Her son was sleeping peacefully, hugging the music book she had kept for so many years. Next to the bed, she found a paper with musical notes drawn in a childish manner, his first attempt at composition. "Where were you?" James's voice cut through the silence. He was standing at the door of the room, his tie loose and the smell of whiskey betraying the work meeting. "We need to talk," Sarah replied, gently closing Ethan's bedroom door. "But not here." In the library, Sarah positioned herself by the window, keeping her distance from James. The late afternoon light painted long shadows on the Persian carpet, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was about to happen. "You missed lunch with the partners," James began, his voice controlled but laden with threat. "I had to make up an excuse. Do you have any idea how ridiculous you made me look?" "Interesting you talk about looking ridiculous," Sarah responded, her voice surprisingly calm. "While I was building my future, you were having another meeting with your intern." James took a step forward, but Sarah didn't back down. "Don't change the subject. Where were you?" "At the Walker Cultural Center." She took the contract out of her bag. "Signing this." James grabbed the papers, his eyes quickly scanning the pages. His face turned red as he read. "Have you lost your mind? Do you really think I'm going to allow my wife to work as some common piano teacher? Your permission isn't necessary, James. I'm not your property." He laughed, a cold and calculated sound. "No? And who paid for all this?" He gestured around. "Who gave you and Ethan a queen's life? You think you can simply buy people?" Sarah completed. "Yes, you tried. With your money, your jewelry, your parties. But you know what you never managed to buy, James? My soul." Poetic now? That Walker boy is already filling your head with nonsense. Michael and Anthony offered me something you would never understand. Respect, for who I am, for my talent. James tore the contract in half. "There, this madness is over." Sarah smiled, taking another envelope from her bag. "That was a copy. The original is already safely stored." James's expression changed. For the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. "You can't do this to me. Think of the scandal, your reputation." "My reputation?" Sarah approached him. "And your reputation, James? What would your partners say if they knew about Amanda, about the others before her?" "Are you threatening me?" "No, I'm just showing that I'm no longer that woman you could manipulate." James punched the desk, making Sarah take a step back. "You're not taking my son. Ethan will stay where he chooses to stay. And you know what's interesting? He chooses music, just like his mother." At that moment, they heard a sound coming from downstairs, the first clumsy notes of Ode to Joy on the piano. Ethan had woken up. "He has talent," said Sarah, tears in her eyes. "How did you never notice that?" "Talent doesn't pay bills," James growled. "You want to go, go, but don't think it'll be easy. I have connections, influence. I can make your life hell." Sarah walked to the library door. "You've already done that, James. The difference is that now I choose my own music." She went down the stairs to find Ethan at the piano. She sat next to him and began to guide his small hands over the keys. James watched from the top of the stairs, his empire of control crumbling to the sound of a simple melody. "Mommy," Ethan whispered, "can we play together every day now?" Sarah hugged her son, feeling her heart beat to the same rhythm as the notes they were producing. "Yes, my love, and I'm going to teach you all the songs my mother taught me." In the piano's reflection, she saw James going up the stairs defeated. She knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in years, she felt no fear. The music had awakened within her a strength that no threat could silence. The apartment in the cultural center was smaller than the master suite of the mansion. But for Sarah, it represented a universe of possibilities. The cream-colored walls were still bare, except for a single photo, her and Ethan at the piano, taken on the morning she decided to leave. Mrs. Thompson had helped with the discreet move while James was at the office. "The children arrive in an hour," announced Michael, handing her a cup of coffee. He had insisted on helping her organize her first class. "Nervous?" "A little," admitted Sarah, adjusting the sheet music on the classroom piano. "It's strange. I spent years playing at important events, but I've never felt as anxious as I do now." "It's because this is real," he replied, sitting in one of the chairs. "It's no longer a performance to please others. It's you truly being yourself." The sound of children's voices filled the corridor. 20 children, between 8 and 12 years old, entered the room with curious eyes. Sarah recognized in their faces the same passion for music she saw in Ethan. "Good morning," she began, feeling her voice tremble slightly. "My name is Sarah, and today we're going to start our journey together through music." A girl raised her. "Hinasim, is it true that you used to play at rich people's parties?" Sarah smiled. "Yes, but you know what? Music doesn't care about money or status. It speaks directly to our soul." The next 2 hours passed like a dream. Sarah discovered that teaching was more rewarding than any performance she had ever given. Each small achievement of her students, each correct note, each smile of understanding was a victory. During the break between classes, Anthony appeared with worrying news. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his usually jovial face serious. "James was at the foundation board this morning." Sarah felt her stomach sink. "What did he do?" "He tried to convince some members that you're emotionally unstable for the position. He even suggested that you had been institutionalized for psychological problems in the past." "But that's a lie," she exclaimed, indignant. "We know," intervened Michael, who had just entered the room. "That's why we've already talked to our lawyers. If he continues with these defamations, he'll be sued." Sarah sat down, feeling the weight of reality. "He's not going to stop, is he? He's going to try to destroy everything I'm building here." "Only if you allow it," Anthony replied, gently. "Besides, we have a surprise that might help." Michael opened his laptop and showed Sarah an email. It was from the National Conservatory, confirming her participation in a classical music festival that would take place in 3 months. "But I didn't sign up for any festival," she said, confused. "I signed you up," admitted Michael. "After hearing you play at the party, I knew I needed to share your talent with more people. It'll be a perfect response to James's accusations." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. "I haven't played at a festival in years. What if I'm not ready?" "You're more than ready," assured Anthony, "and you have 3 months to prepare. Besides, your classes here are the best preparation possible." At that moment, they heard knocks on the door. It was Ethan, brought by Mrs. Thompson for his private lesson after school. The boy ran to hug his mother. "Daddy is angry," he whispered. "He said he's going to bring you back home." Sarah hugged her son tightly. "Ethan, look at me. This is our home now. Here we can be who we really are." Michael watched the scene with a discreet smile. "How about we show Ethan the concert hall? We have a Steinway grand piano waiting to be played." The boy's eyes sparkled. In the concert hall, Sarah sat at the piano with her son. As they played a simplified version of Mozart together, she realized that she was, for the first time in years, truly happy. "Mommy," said Ethan as they played, "Amanda was at our house yesterday. She and Daddy were fighting." Sarah exchanged a significant look with Michael. James's lies were starting to crumble on all sides. "Focus on the music, my love," she replied softly. "That's what matters now." At the end of the day, when everyone had already left, Sarah remained in the concert hall. Her fingers glided over the keys, beginning to compose something new, a song that spoke of new beginnings, of courage, of love. In the empty audience, Michael watched her in silence, respecting that moment of creation. The music echoed through the cultural center like a manifesto of freedom, while outside, night fell over the city, bringing with it the promise of a new dawn. The sound of the piano filled the concert hall in the early hours of the morning. Sarah was rehearsing the piece she would present at the festival, an original composition that blended classical elements with her recent experiences. Through the large windows, The rising sun painted the environment with golden hues, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Impressive, Michael's voice surprised her. He was standing at the entrance holding 2 cups of coffee. Did you compose this? Sarah stopped playing, accepting the coffee he offered. Yes, I call it Metamorphosis in C major. It's not finished yet, but it's perfect, he interrupted, sitting beside her on the piano bench. It tells a story without using words. It's my story, Sarah admitted, her fingers gently caressing the keys. Each note represents a moment in this journey. The moment was interrupted by Anthony, who hurriedly entered the room. Sarah, we have a problem. James has filed for unilateral custody of Ethan. The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's hands, spilling its contents on the floor. Michael quickly supported her, noticing that she had turned pale. He claims that you're emotionally unstable and that your new career doesn't offer financial stability to raise the boy, Anthony continued, his voice grave. He also mentions your long working hours and the inappropriate environment of the cultural center. Inappropriate? Sarah stood up, indignant. And the environment he created was appropriate? With his mistresses, his manipulations, his contempt for art. Calm down. Michael held her hands, which were trembling. We've already contacted our lawyers. James has no basis for these allegations. But he has money and influence, Sarah added, letting the tears flow. He knows all the judges in the city. At that moment, they heard voices in the corridor. It was the first group of students arriving for class. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. Go teach your class, Anthony encouraged. The best way to prove James wrong is to continue your work. Show that you're building something significant here. During the class, Sarah surprised herself with her own strength. Each child who learned a new note, each smile of achievement, was proof that she was on the right path. During the break, she received a message from Mrs. Thompson. Ethan won't stop talking about the piano lessons. He's composing his first song. The text was accompanied by a video of the boy at the mansion's piano, playing a simple but enchanting melody. In the background, James's irritated voice could be heard. Enough of that noise. He won't be able to silence the music, Michael murmured, who was watching the scene. Not in you, not in Ethan. In the afternoon, during the rehearsal for the festival, Sarah transformed all her anguish into music. Her hands flew over the keys with an intensity that surprised even Anthony, who was watching from the audience. You know what your mother always used to say? He commented during a break. That true music comes from the soul, not the fingers. You're proving that now. But is it enough? Sarah questioned. For the festival? To keep Ethan? It's more than enough, Michael replied, who had returned, with old sheet music. Look at this. They were newspaper clippings about Elizabeth's performances, Sarah's mother. In one of them, there was a photo of her pregnant with Sarah on stage at the City Theatre. Your mother never let anyone tell her she couldn't be an artist and a mother at the same time, Anthony explained, and you shouldn't let them either. That night, when everyone had already left, Sarah remained at the cultural center, working on her composition. The notes flowed naturally, telling a story of loss, love, and rebirth. Michael returned later, bringing dinner. I thought you might need to eat something. As they shared the improvised meal on the auditorium stage, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. You know, for years, I thought I had to choose between being an artist and being a mother. James convinced me of that, but now I see that I can be both and be better at both because of it. And you're proving it every day, Michael replied, his gaze overflowing with admiration. Every child you teach, every note you play, every moment with Ethan, it's all part of the same symphony. Thunder sounded in the distance, announcing an approaching storm. Sarah returned to the piano, her hands naturally finding the keys. This part of the music, she explained, playing a particularly emotional section, is about transforming pain into beauty, about finding strength when we think we have nothing left. Michael watched her in silence, hypnotized not just by the music but by the transformation he saw before his eyes. Sarah was no longer the fragile woman from the party. She was a force of nature, as powerful as the storm now falling outside. James may try to take everything from me, she said, without stopping playing. "But there's one thing he'll never be able to steal: the music that lives inside me." A week before the festival, Sarah found Amanda waiting for her at the entrance of the cultural center. The former intern looked different. The usual air of superiority had been replaced by an expression of concern. "We need to talk," said Amanda, her voice trembling slightly. "It's about James." Sarah hesitated, but something in the young woman's gaze made her agree. She led her to her classroom, where the piano served as a silent witness to another chapter of this story. "He's planning something," Amanda began, sitting in one of the chairs meant for students. "Something to ruin your performance at the festival." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, studying the young woman's face. Amanda took a deep breath, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Because I discovered I'm not the first, nor will I be the last. James, he has a pattern. He seduces, manipulates, discards." Sarah sat at the piano, her fingers automatically finding the keys, playing a soft melody to calm her own nerves. "What exactly is he planning?" "He hired people to boo during your performance, and he plans to use your reaction to prove to the judge that you're emotionally unstable." Michael, who had silently entered the room, cleared his throat to announce his presence. Amanda startled but continued. "There's more. He's pressuring festival sponsors to withdraw their support. He's using his connections to spread rumors about your psychological problems." "Why the change of sides, Amanda?" Michael asked, his voice neutral but firm. The young woman took an envelope from her bag. "Because I found this in his office. They're reports from private investigators. He keeps dossiers on all of us. He uses this information to manipulate us, to threaten us if we try to say anything." Sarah stopped playing, absorbing the gravity of the situation. "And why did you decide to risk it now?" "Because I saw Ethan the other day at the office. He was playing piano on a cell phone app hidden from his father. James caught him, and the way he spoke to him, how he humiliated him." Amanda wiped away her tears. "I realized he'll do to his own son what he did to all of us. He'll crush any spark of individuality, any passion." Michael took the envelope, examining its contents. "This could be useful for our cause." "There's one more thing," Amanda continued. "James isn't doing well financially. The firm is losing clients due to some questionable decisions he's made. That's why he's so desperate to maintain control over you and your money, Sarah." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, watching her students arriving for the afternoon classes. Among them was Ethan, brought by Mrs. Thompson, his small face lighting up when he saw his mother. "The festival is in a week," said Sarah, turning back to Amanda. "Why should we trust you?" "Because I have something to lose too," she replied, standing up. "James has information about me that could destroy my career before it even begins. But I realized that continuing to stay silent would destroy me in a much worse way." Michael gestured to Anthony, who had just arrived, and quickly updated him on the situation. The businessman listened attentively, his usually jovial face marked by seriousness. "This changes everything," Anthony finally said, "but it also gives us a unique opportunity." "How so?" asked Sarah. "The festival will be live-streamed," explained Michael, a smile beginning to form on his face. "And now we know exactly what James is planning. We can use this to our advantage," Anthony completed. "Transform your performance into something much bigger than a musical performance." Sarah returned to the piano, her hands naturally finding the keys. The melody that emerged was different now, no longer melancholic but determined, powerful. "Your music," said Amanda, listening attentively. "It tells a story, doesn't it?" "Every piece of music tells a story," Sarah replied, "and it's time to tell mine completely." That afternoon, while teaching her students, Sarah felt a new energy flowing through her music. Ethan, sitting beside her at the piano, smiled with each note he managed to get right. "Mommy," he whispered during a break, "I composed a song for your festival." Sarah hugged her son, feeling her heart overflow with love and determination. In the corner of the room, Michael and Anthony discussed the details of the plan with Amanda, who seemed to have found her own redemption by choosing the right side of the story. Rain began to fall outside, but inside the cultural center, a new symphony was about to begin, one that would speak not just of music, but of truth, justice, and liberation. The City Theatre was packed on the night of the festival. Backstage, Sarah adjusted the midnight blue dress that Michael had specially chosen for the occasion. Through the curtain, she could see the audience settling in, familiar and unfamiliar faces that would soon witness not just a musical performance, but an act of liberation. "He's here," Amanda whispered, approaching nervously. "James just arrived. With his special guests, I identified at least 15 people strategically positioned to start the booing." Sarah nodded, surprisingly calm. "Where's Ethan?" "In the front row with Mrs. Thompson and Anthony. Michael is coordinating the technical team for the live stream." The grand piano at the center of the stage gleamed under the lights, as if also awaiting the decisive moment. Sarah approached it, softly touching its keys in silence, a ritual her mother had taught her to connect with the instrument before each performance. "Mrs. Parker," called the festival director, "it's time." Before stepping onto the stage, Sarah looked at the small altar she had set up in her dressing room, the photo of her mother at her last concert, her father's old sheet music, and a recent drawing by Ethan, her at the piano, surrounded by colorful musical notes. The curtains opened. The spotlight momentarily blinded her, but when her eyes adjusted, she saw Ethan smiling in the front row. Beside him, Michael discreetly waved, confirming that everything was ready. Sarah sat at the piano and before she began to play, did something unexpected. She took the microphone. "Good evening. The piece I'll present tonight is called Metamorphosis in C major. It's a story about silencing and liberation, about losing your voice and finding it again. I dedicate this performance to my son, Ethan, who taught me that music is stronger than any attempt to silence it." Her fingers touched the first notes. The melody began softly, almost hesitantly, like her life in the first years with James. Gradually, the music grew in complexity and volume, each chord telling a part of her story. That's when it started, exactly as Amanda had warned. Isolated, boos strategically positioned throughout the audience. Sarah continued playing, her music now mixed with sounds of disapproval. But then, something unexpected happened. Ethan stood up from his seat and began to play on a small keyboard that Anthony had hidden under the chair. The childish melody he had composed for his mother intertwined perfectly with her music. One by one, Sarah's students, scattered throughout the audience with small instruments, began to join the performance. The symphony that was born from this moment wasn't on the program, but it was more powerful than anything rehearsed. James, watching from the fifth row, stood up furiously, but his voice of protest was silenced by the music that now filled every inch of the theater. On the giant screens installed on the stage, images began to appear. Videos of Sarah's classes at the cultural center, testimonials from her students, Ethan's smile at the piano. The last image was the most impactful, a recording of James threatening Amanda and other former interns, revealing his true character. The businessman tried to advance towards the stage, but security guards discreetly restrained him. Sarah continued playing, her tears now flowing freely. Her music had transformed into something greater than herself. It was the voice of all who had been silenced, of all who had found their liberation in art. When the last note sounded, the entire theater was on its feet. The applause that followed wasn't just for the musical performance, but for the act of courage that everyone had witnessed. Ethan ran to the stage, throwing himself into his mother's arms. "We did it, Mommy. Our music won." James had disappeared from the theater, but Sarah barely noticed his absence. Surrounded by her students, by Michael, Anthony, and even Amanda, she finally felt complete. "That was incredible," said Michael, handing her a bouquet of flowers. "You transformed an attempt at humiliation into a moment of collective triumph." "Music always finds a way," Sarah replied, hugging Ethan. "My mother used to say that, and only now do I fully understand what she meant." Backstage, as the adrenaline was still running high, Anthony approached with news. "The live stream was an absolute success. Social media is exploding with your story. And I just received a call from the National Conservatory. They want you to be a guest professor next semester. Sarah looked at Ethan, who was still holding his small keyboard. What do you think? My love, ready for another musical adventure? The boy's smile was all the answer she needed. The night that should have been her end had transformed into a new beginning, not just for her, but for everyone her music had touched. 1 year after. The festival, the cultural center, was buzzing with the energy of dozens of children rehearsing for the end-of-year recital. Sarah watched from the door of her classroom as Ethan, now 8 years old, helped the younger students with their sheet music. Her son had become not just a promising pianist, but also a little teacher, inheriting from her the passion for sharing. Music. I still get emotional seeing these scenes, said Michael, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. In the past few months, he had become more than a supporter. He was a companion, someone who understood and encouraged her art. Sometimes it feels like a dream, Sarah replied, accepting the coffee. I remember the woman I was a year ago, so trapped, so silenced. Life had changed dramatically after the festival. The video of her performance, along with the revelations about James, went viral on social media. Other women began to come forward, sharing similar stories of manipulation and control. What was meant to be just a musical performance had transformed into a larger movement. James, facing allegations of moral harassment and financial irregularities, had left the city. The last news Sarah had of him was through Amanda, who now coordinated a legal assistance project for women at the Cultural Center. Did you see the new arrangement Ethan created? Asked Anthony, entering the room with a sheet music in his hands. He mixed your Metamorphosis in C major with the melody he composed. The result is impressive. Sarah took the sheet music, recognizing her son's careful handwriting. The music she had composed during her most difficult moments had been transformed into something new in Ethan's hands, no longer a story of pain, but of rebirth. By the way, Anthony continued, the National Conservatory wants to expand the scholarship program for young talents. They were impressed with our results here. The project that started as a small music school had grown. Now the Cultural Center offered not just piano lessons, but a complete music education program for children from underprivileged communities. Sarah discovered that her true calling was not just in playing, but in awakening the love for music in others. "Mommy," called Ethan, running to her, "can I show my new song to everyone at the recital?" "Of course you can, my love," she replied, hugging her son. "What's its name?" "Chords of Freedom," he said proudly. "It's about us." The afternoon, during the general rehearsal for the recital, Sarah sat at the piano with Ethan. As they played together, she observed the faces of her students, each with their own story, their own music to tell. Mrs. Thompson, who had chosen to stay with them after leaving the mansion, entered, the room carrying a covered object. "I found this among your father's things," she said, removing the cloth. It was Charlie's old toolbox. Inside, all the instruments he used to tune pianos were perfectly preserved, along with a notebook of annotations. He recorded every piano he tuned, Sarah explained to Michael, leafing through the notebook fondly. He said each instrument had its own personality, its own voice. "Just like people," Michael replied, gently kissing her forehead. The sound of children's laughter filled the room as the students began to arrive for the rehearsal. Among them was Sophie, a 10-year-old girl who reminded Sarah of herself, shy but with a natural talent that just needed encouragement to flourish. "Teacher," Sophie called, "can I play that song you taught me, the one your mother used to sing?" Sarah smiled, remembering Elizabeth. "Of course, dear. But first tell me, what does this song mean to you?" "It means I can be anything I want to be," the girl replied, her eyes shining. "Just like you." At that moment, watching her students, her son, and the new life she had built, Sarah understood that her journey had been much more than an escape from an oppressive marriage. It was a return to herself, to her essence. The piano that was once used as a status symbol in a cold mansion was now an instrument of transformation, touching not just music but lives. Each note, each chord, each melody was a testimony that true wealth isn't in what we possess, but in the freedom to be who we truly are. "Is everyone ready?" Sarah asked, positioning herself at the piano to start the rehearsal. The children took their places. Ethan sat beside her, and Michael watched proudly from the front row. The music that began to play wasn't just a composition. It was the melody of the life she had chosen to live, a symphony of freedom that would continue to echo through generations.